Good morning.
Welcome, everyone, to our discussion on the Doctrine and Covenants. Today, we record this a little bit prior to when we actually send it out, but we have just passed through the weekend of President Nelson's passing and of the tragic events that happened in Michigan. So at the church house there. And so our hearts are full of people who are mourning at this time, not just for those two events, but other things worldwide. And we also know that at some point we will be sustaining a new prophet, and a new prophet will be set apart and ordained. So today we're going to mention briefly a couple of things from section 111 through 114, but we really want to kind of veer a little bit and talk about succession in the presidency. We want to go back to Joseph Smith and his first presidency in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and then look at how things have changed, as not changed, but how things have continued to grow line upon line, so that we today know that there will be a prophet who will be president of the church to lead and guide in the first presidency. And so we wanted to talk about that today. And I'm joined today by my friend Carol Fogelman, and hopefully Tasha Parker can join us here shortly. Carol, just introduce yourself, my friend. We're so glad you're here.
Hi, I'm Carol Fogelman, and I have been a seminary teacher and I am an institute teacher and love to discuss the gospel and the scriptures.
That is totally true. Carol and I kind of geek out about the scriptures. We love them so much. And I start my institute classes all the time by saying, I love these chapters. And people are like, you say that about all the chapters. But I do. I like study them and I get excited about them. And so I know my friend Carol does that too. So we just truly love speaking of the scriptures and of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we're grateful that you are willing to join with us as we talk today. Um, like, like this weekend with President Nelson passing, I'm so grateful for him and know he is a prophet of God. At the time of Joseph Smith and the martyrdom, Sister Valette Kimball, wife of Heber C. Kimball, this is what she stated. She said, "Every heart is filled with sorrow, and the very streets of Nauvoo seem to mourn." And I think that's kind of the way I've sensed the general population of the church feeling, even members, even those who are friends of other faiths. Just the mourning of and the sorrow of a prophet departing, and what that means. And for many of us, we've grown accustomed to how it moves from one prophet to the calling of another prophet. But in church history, which was what we're studying this year, they weren't certain. In fact, there were papers that actually published that since Joseph Smith died, it would kind of seal the fate of Mormonism, right? That they can't get another Joseph Smith, or that they couldn't have another, they wouldn't be able to move forward. But yet we know that Brigham and the Quorum of the 12 understood it differently, and they helped the saints to understand it differently as well. So I've got a little bit of a PowerPoint that I'd like to share that hopefully would give us some tidbits of information. Because if you recall, back at the time of Joseph Smith, when he passes, people are debating, is this going to go on? Is the church still or is it still organized like it should? Those that did feel close to Joseph and knew that he was heavy about his persecutors actually coming to kill him, many thought, well, okay, if Joseph passes, then it'd be his brother Hiram who will lead the church. Because at the time, Hiram Smith was assistant president of the church. So you have Joseph Smith president and Hiram Smith assistant president of the church. That position had been held by Oliver Cowdery, but then Oliver Cowdery left the church. And so Joseph and Hiram held that kind of office together, which is not what we see now. And in the scriptures, it talks about them being testators, meaning they are there to testify, to have that law of witnesses about the things that the Lord was restoring. So, because Hiram is also martyred at the time of Joseph Smith, that becomes a little bit of a problem. They're like, what's going to happen now? Not to mention the fact, Tasha, welcome, my friend. We're so glad that you're here. Not to
Thank you.
mention, yeah. Oh, and you're in a different place than normal.
Yes, I am.
Oh, well, we're so glad you're here.
So thank you. It's my kitchen.
Sorry, I just barely recognized that. I was like, oh, that's different. So let me just share this PowerPoint and we'll talk for a minute about some of these things that hopefully will help us to have just a better understanding of it all. Okay. And it might or it might not. I'm just talking historically so that we can understand what's going to happen in this next period of time. Now, Joseph had not directed the quorum of the 12 apostles about this is what happens next and this is what happens next. Yet he had been feeling heavy because of the persecution and the threats against his life. So there was this room for uncertainty. There was this room for what is going to happen after Joseph passes. Now, during the martyrdom, we know that Joseph is accompanied by not only Hiram, but Willard Richards and John Taylor, who were members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And so you have those together in Carthage, but you have many of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles who are out and about, some on missions, some are actually campaigning for Joseph as president of the United States. And so they're out and about and get the word. In fact, Brigham Young is here in the Salem and Boston area where I live, which is kind of interesting. So this is what we understand about what was happening at that time. Carol, do you want to read this for us?
Sure. On 5th of December, 1834, the prophet Joseph Smith ordained Oliver Cowdery as assistant president of the church. See History of the Church 2176. He had been with the prophet when the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthoods were restored. When the Church of Jesus Christ was organized in 1830, Oliver was second elder, stood next to Joseph in authority. Thus, whenever priesthood authority or keys were restored, Oliver was with the prophet Joseph. It was necessary, according to the divine power of the witnesses for Joseph Smith, to have a companion holding those keys. Oliver Cowdery was not only to assist Joseph Smith in presiding over the church, but he was also to stand with the prophet as a second witness of the restoration. By 1838, Oliver Cowdery had lost his office of assistant president through apostasy and excommunication. But in 1841, the Lord called Hiram Smith to fill this office. The president and the assistant president, or the first and second witness, would seal their testimonies with their blood at Carthage jail.
Now, that first paragraph backs up everything we have seen, even with the Kirtland Temple and the keys being restored. Oliver was there with the prophet Joseph in the Kirtland Temple, as we discussed last week, when the veils were drawn and their veil off their mind is taken and they're able to see the Lord and have those keys restored. But shortly afterwards, a couple years later, we have this shift. Oliver has now left the church, and so that office of assistant president falls to Hiram. And again, Hiram will stand as a second witness to so many things. Sometimes we forget that. And then they both witness to the world through their martyrdom that this is the Lord's work. Now, that's an important thing to recognize, because people did think, okay, if Joseph passes, then we've got Hiram, we're good, it's all going to be fine, we've got another another president of the church. But then they both pass through the martyrdom. And so questions begin. Now, we studied in section 107 these things about the quorum of the 12 apostles. So, Tasha, do you want to read these for us? You got to unmute, my friend. Sorry.
The quorum of the 12 apostles constitute a quorum equal in authority to the first presidency and hold the keys to establishing the church throughout the world. That's in Doctrine and Covenants 107, 24, and 35. Further, in Nauvoo, Joseph had shared confidential information with them about new revelations, temple ordinances, plural marriage, and plans to settle in the American West. He also gave the 12 important responsibilities, including authority in 1841 over the saints, where stakes were organized, not just in areas without stakes, and ecclesiastical and temporal authority in Nauvoo. The Quorum of the 12 Apostles as a group led the church under the direction of Quorum President Brigham Young until 1847, when Young called counselors and reconstituted the first presidency.
Let's go ahead and read those verses in section 107. Now, this statement actually is from the church's website about this time period. Carol, do you want to read section 107, verse 24 and 35?
Sure. And they form a quorum, equal in authority and power to the three presidents previously mentioned. Let me go to 35. The 12 being sent out, holding the keys to open the door by the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and first unto the Gentiles and then unto the Jews.
Now, it's beautiful to hear that the Lord is line upon line, step by step, guiding this word forward. So we have here in this time period of 1835, a knowledge that the quorum of the 12 apostles and the first presidency, they hold the keys, equal in power and authority to each other. And that's an important thing for us to recognize. Now, was that understood? Did people talk about that? Was that shared in discussions? Yes, but did people all understand it? No, of course not. And had they seen how that works, like had they seen what that looked like or what that meant, the lived experiences and the words to put to what that looks like had not come yet. They were still growing into that. And so keys are an important thing that they're trying to understand. So we have keys being restored, John the Baptist, Peter, James, and John, Kirtland Temple, and now they're beginning to understand who has keys, as section 107 has helped us to know, and how to use those keys or what those keys are for. Another time that we have in the historical records, and this is from the Joseph Smith papers, so I'm sorry it's really tiny. You can see the cursive written page that they have of these minutes in the Council of 50 meeting in 1844. And then, of course, they have the typed portion. I love that the Joseph Smith papers just put that side by side. The Council of 50 was an organization in Nauvoo, not necessarily all of members, but of men who counseled together. So councils had begun to be a part of the regular church administration since they started organizing the High Council and quorums. And now here in Nauvoo, they're going to have this Council of 50 to try and make decisions. And that is the way of the Lord. So in this minute, in the minutes of the Council of 50 here in 1844, again, you have the record that Joseph Smith is telling them that you have the keys. You can, I don't know if you can see it, but it's here in this indented paragraph where it says, it may be that my enemies will kill me. And in case they should, and the keys and the powers which rest on me not be imparted to you, they will be lost from the earth. But if I can only succeed in placing them on your heads, then let me fall a victim to murderous hands if God will suffer it. And I can go on with all pleasure and satisfaction, knowing that my work is done and the foundation laid on which the kingdom of God is to be reared in this dispensation of the fullness of times. Upon the shoulders of the 12 must the responsibility of leading this church henceforth rest until you shall appoint another to succeed you. So he does, even though he doesn't specifically tell them this is how it works and this is what you do step by step, even though there was this debate about what should happen after Joseph dies. It had been written down on occasion, these key points that the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency hold the keys of the church. So the Church of Jesus Christ isn't going to be overthrown just if you kill the prophet. After Joseph passes, there are a number of options that emerge, and there are different things that happen. Tasha or Carol, do you guys remember the stories about what happens in Nauvoo after Joseph passed, and the confusion about who should lead the church? Anybody want to share what you know?
Carol, go ahead.
It's
You look like you're
interesting.
nodding.
Well, it's interesting because I have an ancestor who had two brothers, and all three of them took different routes when these questions came up, and eventually all ended up the two that went away from the main body of the church eventually came back. But it's interesting just the questions that were there. Sidney Rigdon, of course, felt that he was the guardian of the church and had been, uh, I guess, in a way, campaigning that he would be the next in line. And when we had this conference where people were trying to decide what the next step would be, there was a wind that nobody could even hear what Sidney Rigdon was saying. And Sidney Rigdon, who normally had this ability to really put into words the things that he was wanting to convey to people, couldn't even put a thought together. He was really struggling with the words that he would say. And then Brigham Young stood at the back and began to speak. And it was a shared experience with all the people who were there that they witnessed him speaking. That some of the accounts talk about not only the voice of Joseph Smith, but his mannerisms, and that it seemed to them that Joseph Smith was there among them as he was speaking.
Yeah, it is interesting how that happened. So that story is in the book The Saints.
Mm-hmm.
People want to go back and refer to that. So the apostles are coming back as they hear what has happened, and Sidney, who had been closer, he's there now and doing exactly what Carol had said. So Sidney is the one that calls the meeting for all of the people close to the temple site there. But it was on the same time and day that Brigham Young had called a meeting with the 12 or whoever had come into town so far. And they conflicted in time. And so when Brigham Young hears that Sidney is doing this meeting, that's when Brigham Young changes his plans. He's like, no, we're going to go to Sidney's meeting. And Sidney really was pressing that idea of guardianship, that he could be the guardian. And I'm grateful that you shared that part about the witness that people had, that it really sounded like Joseph. And then they wrote that it looked like Joseph. And I find that to be an interesting story. And after these two had kind of come forward and said, this is the way it should go, this is the way it should go, they do call an assembly of the saints later, a couple days later, and they witness that the apostles have been leaders in many places throughout the world and had been given that from Joseph. And so they were reassured that the mantle had fallen on Brigham. And yet, over the next years, there are these other figures who draw away people from Brigham. So let's go back to that screen. Tasha, did you have anything you wanted to share with that?
No, I'm not as well versed on this as I should be, it looks like. So So keep going.
Oh, no, you're
Thank
doing
you.
wonderful. Thank you for being here with us. So the saints do agree that it's going to be the apostles and Brigham Young. But Sydney's idea was it remains with the first presidency. And so I'm going to be the guardianship of it because I'm still here. Others thought more along biblical lines, and biblical lines, meaning it could have come from two different trains of thought. They could have thought New Testament, where it meant apostles. And so they were looking at Brigham Young. Or they could have thought Old Testament, father to son, like Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. And so there were some who felt like Joseph Smith III needed to be the president, but he was only 11 at the time. There was another man called James Strang who felt like he had had an experience like Joseph had. This is what he shared. He really was a deceiver, but they didn't know that at the time. So he's sharing an experience like Joseph had about an appearance of God and that he was now called. And so there are some who follow James. There are some who follow Sydney. There are some who break off and later on have a church they called that was reorganized. Others felt like it should be the church patriarch, William Smith. So there were a couple of different ideas out there. And some of them did find some followers. So that was an interesting time. And I don't know how I would have felt. Have you guys ever experienced a time during the transition of prophets where you felt like the church was a little lost? Like, what has been your experience?
I've never had that experience. I've
Yeah.
always felt like, in fact, and with perfect respect to all my Catholic friends who I just love so much, I have so many that I just really revere and love, almost to the point of I'm thinking, they're better saints than I am. You know what I mean? From all my good friends. But the conclave, as that was happening with the new pope and everything, and I was, kind of just seeing the difference between the two different ways in which things are done, and maybe you'll go into this later, but it just really does give me a lot of comfort knowing that we literally claim that the Lord, himself has picked the next prophet, through revelation, and this isn't a voting situation or vying for office or, running for office. And so it's just always been in my lifetime. I've never had this experience, obviously, of what you're referring to, but it has been just such a peaceful and confirming feeling. I think that, we know that how this is done now, because I didn't live back then, right? So
Thank you, Tasha.
I know for myself, back when President Hinckley passed away, in the months leading up to that, I remember I was going through some things personally. And I remember just really struggling with the idea of if President Hinckley were to die, because I just really had a lot of love and respect for him, and I didn't know President Monson very well, and I was really. It's funny to say this, but I was at the time, because of things going on in my life, I was struggling with this idea that he wasn't going to be with us forever. And I remember I was sitting in a leadership meeting, and President Monson got up to speak. And as he was speaking, I felt it. I felt the Spirit tell me President Hinckley has passed, and this is the next prophet. And I didn't know it at the time. It hadn't been announced. I had no idea that any of these things had, in fact, actually happened, that President Hinckley had passed away. But just the way that President Monson was speaking, the things that he was saying, I felt the Spirit confirm to me, this is the Lord's prophet. And it was an experience I needed at the time. And so I think, sometimes when somebody, when somebody dies, sometimes we make people feel unintentionally make people feel like they can't mourn, because that's a lack of faith, which is not true. Mourning means that we actually are loving people the way the Savior wants us to love them. And we also sometimes unintentionally send a message that if we have a question or we have a concern, that we're somehow not being faithful. And even now, with the passing of President Nelson, the Lord wants us to ask. He wants us to seek that personal revelation for ourselves. And no, it's certainly not like this time in early church history when you had this was new to everybody. They were trying to figure out what to do. The church was being restored, um, and so we know the pattern that the Lord has now. But he also wants us to have that witness for ourselves because we need it. We're going to hear things from the prophet about how we need to conduct ourselves, how we need to live our lives, the counsel he is going to give. And we need that witness for ourselves that he is the Lord's prophet so that we can have confidence in following the things we're asked to do.
I'm so grateful that you would share that. My first experience in recognizing or in kind of feeling a loss, President Kimball, when he passed, so he was my childhood prophet, right? And as he passed, I was still a young girl, and it was like, oh, like what's going to happen next? And I didn't know. And it's not like I don't know exactly all that I was feeling, but I just didn't know the process. I didn't know what was going to happen. And it was both sorrow for this prophet that I loved, but also a little bit of confusion just because I was still learning. And like Carol said, I'm grateful that there are opportunities each one of us can have to know that the prophet God has called is his prophet. And it's okay to let that take time. And it's okay to continue to ask for that kind of confirmation. And I am grateful for the examples of people who have done that and for the witnesses that the Lord gives, just like he gave to people there with Brigham Young, where they began to understand and kind of, I'm going to liken it to an Old Testament story when Elijah and Elisha, when that mantle was being passed, people could see the mantle rest on Elisha, and they knew that this was the new prophet. And so I think there are times where the Lord wants us to ask and have our own testimony and understanding and be able to really determine and feel that witness for ourselves. So I pray that each one of us will do that during this time of transition. Now, as we continue to look at this, it was interesting that the quorum of the 12 apostles is now going to step up and lead the church, with, of course, Brigham Young at the head. And yet it will be a significant period of time before the first presidency is actually reorganized, which is kind of interesting. We think 42 months, that's a while. There were a number of things. They were trying to finish the temple. They were trying to then give the endowment and the sealing to those people there. They were then moving out of Nauvoo. Like, what a tremendous time. It was jam-packed. The other thing is that there were so many saints coming from Europe and England into Nauvoo, and then they're moving west, and they had been led by the quorum of the 12 apostles. It was one of the 12 who was over in the different parts of England leading the missions, leading the gospel and the church in those areas. So many of them recognized that the 12 leads. And so there were a number of factors that then happened. I don't know all the reasons behind it, because then after Brigham Young passes, there's still 38 months before John Taylor decides and his group to reorganize the first presidency. And then same with Wilford Woodruff, you have 21 months. But after Wilford Woodruff, you see this change. It's 11 days. And so it's interesting to think, okay, so what is happening to put the pattern into place? Okay. So one of the things we want to recognize is, well, here's a little chart This was shared by Keith Erickson of the Church History Department, and I found it to be very interesting. So we want to think about revelations that Joseph and Oliver are receiving, that Joseph is receiving, and about doctrine and processes and all those kinds of things. And it heightens in 1831, where there's 37 revelations that we have recorded in 1831. And then it significantly dips in 1832, when the first presidency was organized. And then it dips even more in 1834, when the High Council is organized. And then by 1835, it seems to really dip, where we have quorums. This was section 107. Quorums are organized. The 70 is there. It's as if the Lord is moving from a pattern of, you have a question, take it to the prophet's going to take it to the Lord's going to give it back to the prophet's going to disseminate it. They did this with Moses. They came to Moses being the prophet, he took it to the Lord brought it back to Moses disseminated it. But then even Moses has this epiphany and revelation and guidance to organize others who can help. It seems to be that same kind of pattern here, that as the Lord starts to organize these essential councils of the church, revelation to one person declines. And it seems as though revelation now comes to them together. I think that's really interesting. So I believe that the Lord is moving his people towards councils. And like the prophet Moses in the book of Numbers, where he said, would to God that all men were prophets. Meaning, I wish every single person could learn to receive revelation. Guess what President Nelson has been telling us? I wish that everybody could learn that revelation for yourself is so important. So in the 19th and 20th centuries, they grew to rely on councils and that unanimous voice from section 107. As they counseled together, the Spirit would work on them, and they would come to feel it as a group that this was the will of the Lord. And that counsel is reminiscent of the council in heaven, where it fosters love and respect and this unity. So I want to share a little video. I hope you can hear the sound. This is a video of President Irene speaking, and he's going to be standing there in this press conference by Elder Cook, and they are going to be talking about the way that the apostles receive revelation. Now I'm going to speed it up a little bit because I don't think we need to hear the question of the reporter.
In particular,
so I'm going to
do tell you how Elder Cook's in his school.
Okay, here we go. Can you guys hear it?
Actually, the best way to do it is tell you the story. By the way, the president in Hawaii, Steve Wheelwright, who was a professor at Harvard, was my PhD candidate when I was a professor at Stanford. I was his thesis chairman. And so it is a tight web, in terms of people that we know. Although the Lord did that, I had nothing to do with that. But I would just say this. The way to look at Harvard and its effect, at least personally, is with this story. When I first came as the president of Riggs College, I attended my first meeting that I'd ever been in, watching the general authorities of the church, the first presidency and others, running a meeting. I had been studying for the 10 years I was a professor at Stanford, how you make decisions in meetings, in groups. So I got a chance. Here's my chance to see the way the Lord's servants do it, of which I now am one. But my first, I looked at it with my Harvard, Stanford eyes, and I thought, this is the strangest conversation here are the prophets of God, and they're disagreeing in an openness that I had never seen in business. In business, you're careful when you're with the bosses, Here they were and I watched this process of them disagreeing, and I thought, good heavens, I thought revelation would come to them all, and they'd all see things the same way in some sort of, and it was more open than anything I had ever seen in all the groups I'd ever studied in business. I was just dumbfounded. But then after a while, the conversation cycled around and they began to agree. And I saw the most incredible thing, that here are these very strong, very bright people, all with different opinions. Suddenly the opinions began to just line up, and I thought, I've seen a miracle. I've seen unity come out of this wonderful, open kind of exchange that I'd never seen in all my studies of government or business or anywhere else. And so I thought, oh, what a miracle. And then it was President Harold B. Lee was chairing the meeting. I think anyway, it was a Board of Education meeting. And I thought, now he's going to announce the decision because I've seen this miracle. And he said, wait a minute, I think we'll bring this matter up again some other time. I sense there is someone in the room who is not yet settled. And they went on to the next item, and I thought, that is strange. And then I watched somebody, one of the brethren, I think one of the 12, walk past President Lee and say, thank you. There's something I didn't have a chance to say. So I want you to know, the main thing you do about Harvard.
Anyway, isn't that beautiful?
I love it.
It's tell me some of your thoughts about that.
I love that our Father in heaven trusts us. He trusts us to be able to have these councils, to be able to humble ourselves and respect each other enough to have these councils. And he wants to hear our thoughts, and he wants us to hear each other's thoughts. And that's the thing that strikes me, is the tremendous trust our Father in heaven has in us, and his desire for us to grow as his children, because that's really what he's allowing. You think about youth councils that we have in the church. I have been so grateful for the experience that my younger two sons had in youth councils, serving in the stake where I met Tasha, and especially with the influence that her husband was on them. And my husband has told me before about driving them over for these meetings and listening in on the leadership training that happened in these councils, and how they allowed the youth to lead and to voice their thoughts and their opinions. And the youth left those meetings feeling valued and respected, and with a desire to help other youth and to help each other. And when I hear President Eyring speaking about this, that's what I think of. I think of this training that we put the youth through in these council meetings. Well, that's what our Father in heaven is doing in these councils with the brethren as well.
Love that. Thank you for sharing.
I was thinking too of the council in heaven, which you've touched on just a little bit,
Yeah.
and I've often reflected on this, the council in heaven, where we're seeing the Savior step up, you know what I mean? And receive his responsibility and make his covenant to be our Savior, and how wonderful that, like Carol was saying, that we were included in that we could see it happen, that we understood. And I'm wondering if, as Elder Eyring, President Eyring is talking about with the council, is that as you work through that, that revelation scattered among us, but as they working through it, your heart gets behind the cause, because you feel that you've been heard and listened to, and that your mind now is understanding what the Lord's will is. But not only that, not only like, well, all of a sudden now everybody finally got it, like the one person who did have it right, and now everybody's now convinced. It's mostly too that now we understand what problems could be arising, around it. And then you come to the conclusion, having delved into the whys, so that now you have a better understanding of it, and can move forward behind what the Lord wants us to do with a deeper understanding, because you've discussed it, so.
And I think we get stuck in our own head. a lot. And we have a hard time seeing outside of our own needs
Yes.
and our own wants.
Right.
And this pattern that the Lord has in these councils gives us the opportunity to see from somebody else's perspective
Yes. Yeah.
and to hear about things we may not be considering that the Lord wants us to consider.
Mhm.
You know, we get to, in this week of Come Follow Me, get to talk about section 112, where Thomas B. Marsh is the president of the quorum. And I think he is having some of the same problems that you two were just describing. Was he hearing others like he should? Was he understanding that this wasn't just him as a leader getting to dictate what the quorum did, but it was this idea of really coming together to hear each other, to understand, and then to bring our hearts and minds together to really understanding the Lord's will. So that's an amazing thing that we get to learn in section 112. But then at the end of 112, he tells Thomas in verse 28, but purify your hearts before me. Like that's part of what has to happen, whether it's a youth council or a family council, or even the quorum of the 12. And then in verse 32, the keys of the dispensation which ye have received have come down from the fathers, and last of all, being sent down from heaven unto you. Verily I say unto you, behold, how great is your calling. Cleanse your hearts and your garments, lest the blood of this generation be required at your hands. Be faithful until I come, for I come quickly, and my reward is with me, to recompense every man according to his work, according as his work shall be. I am Alpha and Omega. Such beautiful words to even the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and helping him understand his role, his mission, the things that they are to do. As we continue to look at this succession in the presidency, let's just look at a few last things here.
Hey,
So,
Shauna, could
please.
I mention one thing real quick? I
It
think
doesn't have to be quick at all. Go for it.
I just as we've been talking, one of the thoughts that I had is that there is power in unity. We're told that one of the hallmarks of Zion is the unity of her people, and that they were of one heart and one mind, and that's how we are supposed to live. And that's the same thing you see these councils being asked to do, is to have that unity, to be of one heart and one mind. It's a principle of Zion.
That's beautiful.
I love that so much. So Zion can be with us, literally. Just historically speaking, as a review, Joseph did not clearly announce to the public, this is the way it's going to be. He and the Lord really left it open to the people who would then be there to hear the voice of the Lord and continue to lead. And we do have multiple options that came out of this time period. And yet we did have that clear instruction from the Lord that the 12 were the ones that would lead, that the council method would continue to guide their leadership. And so Brigham Young does become president of the church with the first presidency there in December of 1847. And that will actually happen back at Council Bluffs, the Winter Quarters area. When we think about this all, we need to recognize that we can go back and really think and ponder about the people and the experiences they were having and the records that they left about that spiritual witness that Carol mentioned that they had. We can also recognize that this pattern of succession has really been one that has developed over time. It didn't just happen, boom, done with the prophet Brigham Young. It continued to happen. There's a bit of a story that goes into all of that. And we need to kind of clarify any errors that might be in our thinking, where we think, well, the prophet Joseph just should have told everybody. He should have known his death was coming. He should have told everybody specifically so this confusion wouldn't have happened. But that's not God's purpose. He hasn't designed this plan to prevent any of the struggles from happening.
And I have a thought on that. I
Please.
told you about my ancestor who had two brothers, and the three of them each took a different path. One of them followed Strang and his group. What's really interesting is that when you read their stories, you recognize that each of them had the opportunity to come to a knowledge of Brigham Young being the prophet of God through a path that was uniquely theirs.
Mm,
And while it wasn't this straight, okay, yes, I have had this experience. I know that he is the prophet of God. I've witnessed his mantle falling, the Joseph's mantle falling on Brigham. For one of them, my direct line ancestor, that was the case. But for his brothers, it was different. They each personally needed different experiences to help them understand that this was the will of the Lord. And I think it's really important for us to remember that the Lord knows each of us personally and individually. And I think that it's not an accident that they were given this opportunity to see how the Lord wanted his kingdom to function. I think that there was a very personal reason why they were allowed to work this out.
Carol, I really appreciate that. The Lord really wants our agency to be used, and he appreciates the personal efforts that we make. Carol, thank you so much. With this pattern for succession, so we have come to recognize it is the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles who will be the next prophet. President Oaks will be the next prophet. But how did this come to be? So at first, when the Quorum of the 12 is first organized, they're organized according to age, which is kind of interesting. So Thomas B. Marsh, being the oldest, is the president of the Quorum of the 12. But that changed. And as they're called to the quorum, that's what they start looking at next. They're like, okay, when did you receive your call? Okay, this is where you are in the rank then. And then they change that and they're like, no, it needs to be based on the date of ordination. So there were two that were called on the same date, but their dates of ordination were different. So they organized the Quorum of the 12 according to the date of organization. And then a little while later, that changed just slightly, where it was adjusted to be, okay, we're looking at the time you served continuously as an apostle. And then they altered that a little bit more and said, it's not just that the amount of time you served as apostle, but the amount of time you've served in the quorum of the 12 apostles. And so this has even changed a little bit over time. And it's interesting to see when those changes were made historically and the Quorum of the 12 was reordered, I should say, reordered. It's interesting to see that the brothers don't have this, there isn't this contention. Like, I can't believe now I sit lower than you and you sit higher than me. There's these pure-hearted men who still are there doing the job. And then, of course, the practice of the setting apart or ordaining the new president by the laying on of hands began in 1898. So again, when we look at that time, that chart that I set up earlier, it's interesting that those changes here, they start happening, and we can see those time frames of the length of time before the first presidency was reorganized lessening. And so now when we think of succession in the presidency, we can look at President Nelson. Bless his heart, I will miss him. These two brethren here go back into the order of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles based on what we just looked at here, right? All of those parts. And so President Oaks will be the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. President Holland is just acting president. And so the first presidency has automatically been dissolved. And those two counselors are now back in their place by seniority, based on which date they were ordained to the 12 apostles. And so we can even see when two were called on the same day, like Elder Uchtdorf and Elder Bednar, right? We can see when two are called on the same day, who was ordained first. And then we have these 14 who assume the church leadership. Currently, we are being led by Jesus Christ through the 14 apostles, prophets, seers, and revelators that we have now. And the senior president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, the senior apostle, he goes and presides at the meeting that the Quorum of the 12 have. They consider two things. Should the first presidency be reorganized at this time? And they counsel together about it. And should the church continue to function with the Quorum of the 12 presiding? So they counsel about those things. After the discussion, they make a motion and they accept whatever the quorum has felt to be revelation from the Lord. If they have felt the Lord telling them to reorganize the first presidency, the Quorum of the 12 apostles selects the president, and the new president selects the counselors, and they become the first presidency. And we now know it is the longest serving apostle that becomes the president of the church. So after the first presidency has been organized again, the apostle who has served second longest sustains the president of the Quorum of the 12. And they are the ones who set apart the new president of the church through the actual laying on of hands. So we know that President Oakes, who is president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, will become the next prophet. And I'm grateful that the Lord has such a beautiful pattern that he has allowed to be established through councils and the revelation that those councils have received. So tell me some of your thoughts.
I was just going to say, a lot of times, people have said, well, you just do have a system. It's just, the next one in line, it's not really that the Savior has picked these people, but, as we know and can testify that, he was the one that put them in place when they were called, so he is really calling them and knows when, prophets will be taken back through the veil. And he has already, predetermined that. That's how, we know that the Savior has selected the new prophet. And I was going to say that our family was quite heavily involved in some of the backlash that happened when, President Benson was not speaking, at the end of his presidency. A lot of the times he couldn't speak at the end of his presidency. And so people were criticizing, thinking, well, why doesn't he just pass away so that we can have another prophet who can speak for us, and I remember not worrying about this. I'm sure I have the gift of faith because, I just don't worry about those kind of things.
I know you have that gift.
I know some people, do struggle with it. And I think to come to peace knowing that the Lord will, as we've seen through church history, accept change. You know what I mean? That there's going to be times when he will keep the prophet alive just so that his words will be still in effect, what he has counseled us to do. And perhaps there are lots of reasons why the Lord would not allow his prophet to speak. It could be that to test our faith or to see if we aren't living what he's asked us to do, giving us more time mercifully, you know what I mean, to live what he's asked us to do before the next prophet becomes the prophet. But so it was a testimony to me to go back to what he had said. What is he saying that we have not been living and should be living better? And so and then just one last thing I was thinking as we were going through your slides too, is that wow, we've seen a lot of change with President Nelson, and get used to change because the Lord is going to have his hearts of his people, and I like what Carol was saying too, is that, to come to the confirmation that this is the prophet, we are going to stand behind him and follow him and defend him against And there may be a lot of controversial issues coming up here with President Oaks coming into the presidency, but you know, the Lord will bless us and change our hearts and help us to understand why those changes happen if we're close to the Spirit and we're acting as if we're in council with him. We're kind of our own little council with the prophet, and let's come to understand the Lord's will through following him. That's how you come to know he's the prophet, by following his direction, and seeing the blessings that come when you do. So anyway,
Beautiful.
Carol, you were going to say something.
Yeah. I actually, as you were talking, Tasha, I was reminded of a quote by President Hinckley. He says, "This transition of authority in which I have participated a number of times is beautiful in its simplicity. It is indicative of the way the Lord does things. Under his procedure, a man is selected by the prophet to become a member of the council of the 12 apostles. He does not choose this career. He is called, as were the apostles in Jesus' time, to whom the Lord said, 'Ye have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you.' The years passed. He is schooled and disciplined in the duties of his office. He travels over the earth in fulfilling his apostolic calling. It is a long course of preparation in which he comes to know the Latter-day Saints wherever they may be, and they come to know him. The Lord tests his heart and his substance. In this natural course of events, vacancies occur in that council, and new appointments are made. Under this process, a particular man becomes a senior apostle, residing latent in him and in his associate brethren. Given to each at the time of his ordination are all of the keys of the priesthood, but authority to exercise those keys is restricted to the president of the church. At his passing, that authority becomes operative in the senior apostle, who is then named, set apart, and ordained a prophet and president by his associates of the Council of the 12.
Mhm.
And I love this idea of the Lord selecting somebody and then giving them time and opportunity to grow and into who he needs him to be as a prophet. We talked about counsels and seeing another person's perspective. What better way to help a prophet really know his people than to spend that time listening to other people and hearing their perspective, hearing their lived experiences so that they know how best to lead. I think about Brigham Young and the experiences that he had in his early life. He lost his wife and had to be both dad and breadwinner, but also take care of the home. And as a prophet, what was he called to do? He was called to lead the church during a very difficult time when they were still mourning, but life had to move on and they had to find a way to move forward. And he had had this experience early in his life. And that's not to say that it's predestined that
Right.
somebody will be the prophet. We still have choices. We look at section 112. These are directions that were given to Thomas B. Marsh, but he made choices where he apostatized from the church for a time. And, I don't know what the Lord's plans were for him at that time, but he removed himself from that from that line in the choices that he made. But it's
Mhm.
important to look at the way the Lord has his system set up. There is choice, there is the ability to use our moral agency, but he also has this, um, a school, if you would, of years set up for his prophets to become who he needs them to be.
Yeah.
Excellent principles. Any other principles we should think about or remember as we contemplate the succession in the presidency?
Faith takes faith.
It
Faith
does.
to follow the prophet. And many have struggled, but they can have faith. They can have faith and hope that
Yeah.
living this new, President Oaks's council will bring miracles. You'll see miracles. People will see miracles if they listen and obey. That's the formula, listening and obeying, and the Lord will bless you. You'll see that. Just such a beautiful pattern.
I have a very real testimony that our Father in heaven knows what we need, and he calls prophets to be what we need. in the moment we need it. Shauna, you mentioned when President Kimball passed away. I remember I was in primary at the time.
Yeah.
And my family, as I was growing up, went through periods of inactivity. And so I at first struggled a little bit with this idea of President Kimball dying because I too, I was, well, what do we do now? You think about a little primary child not knowing. But my love for the Book of Mormon and for the scriptures came from the words of his prophet, Ezra Taft Benson.
Mm.
My understanding of the need for humility. And it's something I actually keep his talk, Beware of Pride, at the ready to remind myself because I struggle. But I hold on to that because those are words I needed at that time and I need it now. We have had President Nelson during a period of time when we needed somebody with medical background, medical knowledge. And I look at President Oaks and his experiences, and I know he is what the Lord needs us to have now. What a beautiful and compassionate thing that our Father in heaven has set this system up so beautifully and so perfectly.
Yesterday was our stake conference. And as I reflected on the things you just shared, we had our stake presidency. Our stake president was actually conducting the meeting, and he was so tearful in the morning session yesterday. And he had us all stand and sing, "We Thank Thee, O God, for a Prophet," for the opening hymn of stake conference. It was just such a beautiful experience to be standing there and singing that song, to feel the spirit that came, and to truly know that we are led by prophets on the earth today. And the feeling came to me that I personally need to do more to share with others that we do have a prophet in the land, because I am so grateful for that. There is a man here on the earth that does lead and guide the church under the direction of Jesus Christ. And what a beautiful thing to know that there is also then the pattern and the organization so that the keys are never lost from the earth, so that we can have that direction from the Lord. But like President Nelson has been encouraging us, may we each come to have our own spiritual capacity increased to have the revelation we need in these latter days. And part of that revelation that we will need in just these next few days is who the Lord has chosen as his new prophet, and that testimony we can have as we seek it. And so Tasha, your thoughts on faith just really ring true. Let's have faith that the Lord continues his work through his prophets. We're so grateful that you were with us today. We hope that you have a wonderful week studying the sections of 111 through 114. And we look forward to General Conference and hope this has helped just explain the succession in the presidency and what a beautiful thing it is that we will still have a prophet on the earth. And until next time, have a great day. It is in your power to do so.